and get started. So thanks again to everybody for joining today. As I mentioned, this is a new format we're trying out. So we're going to run a short series of webinars that are aimed at a half hour. So as Cammy mentioned, when you're having your snack, have a short series of webinars. Let me give a little bit of background before we get into it. You know, the premise, the idea behind the series of webinars is that blended learning has matured, and it's our phrase going mainstream. You know, I think the phrase, the idea of blended learning has been around for a while, and I think for a couple of years it felt like there was maybe a little bit more smoke than heat in the idea. A lot of interest, but not necessarily a lot of clarity. We think that, you know, we're seeing a time where at the kind of knee bend in the maturity curve, where some organizations are deep into it and have proven practices, other organizations are moving ahead and getting started. It's kind of a time when blended learning is crossing the chasm. So the goal of this webinar series that we're starting up is to try to share something we thought would be, you know, our view, the single most useful thing to some organizations, which is to give concrete, specific, what we called worked examples of how blended learning works in a series of specific domains. So today we'll be sharing ideas about worked examples in leadership. In 3 more weeks we're going to be sharing on sales, then orientation, and then finally one on compliance. So that's the plan for today. We are going to share some worked examples with you. We're going to try to leave some time at the end for Q&A. So thanks for joining. Let's go ahead and let's dig on in. To introduce myself, I am Chip Cleary. I'm the Vice President of Solutions and Consulting here at Kineo. Been in the learning space for 20 years at this point, come up through a technology background, a business consulting background, have a particular interest in business alignment, and a bit of a background in learning design. Doing today's webinar for you along with Cammy Bean. Cammy, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Cammy Bean. I am the Vice President of Learning Design for Kineo, and that essentially means I've been focusing on the e-learning side of our business for the last, seeming forever. I've been in the business since the mid-'90s myself, and I've seen lots of that maturity cycle that Chip has been talking about firsthand. So really excited to be here with you all today and share what we've heard from some of our clients and what some of the trends are that we're seeing in the business.
Great. Super. And just to give a real quick introduction to Kineo, for those who are not familiar with us, we're a workplace learning company. We help organizations improve performance through learning and technology. What Kineo, the phrase itself, means to stir things up. Our mission is to help organizations deliver results through learning. And in the rapidly evolving world of learning, it's a fun place to be. You know, part of that mission is for us to lead knowledge sharing groups like what we're trying to do today. We're part of City and Guilds, which is one of the world's largest learning and skills businesses. City and Guilds itself offers 5,000 qualifications for different jobs in 28 different industries. We work with 10,000 different learning providers in 80 different countries, so a global group. A little bit of background on us. As far as the topic for today, we think that a change, you know, is not just around the corner. In fact, we're now as an industry moving around the corner. As I mentioned up front, the idea of blended learning, it's been around for a long time. And you know, probably any simple story about the world of blended learning is going to be a little bit simplistic, but one way to look at it is that blended learning came about as an antidote to some overly simple-minded ideas about e-learning that were put on the table about 15 years ago. So, you know, for those of us who were back then, around then, that, you know, there was a point in time when many companies began to set targets for moving what was before primarily a face-to-face learning offering, you know, online. And so chief learning officers would have targets that said, by this year I'll have such a percentage of my delivery done online, and by that year I'll have that percentage of delivery online. And, you know, what happened back then was that there was a bit of a whiplash to that, as many organizations didn't necessarily focus as strongly on the impact of the learning that they were delivering, but in a rush to move things online, you know, moved to a little bit of a death by online PowerPoint. And so that led to a backlash. Boy, it just won't really work to take all of our classroom learning and convert it to page turners. Let's do something different. And that led to a little bit more nuanced view of, well, let's do something we'll call blended learning. I think one thing we've seen is that idea of blended learning naturally makes sense. At the same point, it's a pretty broad umbrella. As you think about leadership solutions, as you think about solutions in other areas, what wouldn't fit under the umbrella of blended learning? And I think what we've seen, over the past 5 years, 7 years, is that sometimes it's been kind of difficult to figure out just how do I wade into blended learning in an area. There's so many different choices. Like, does that include assessments? Does it include coaching as part of my program? Does it include action learning assignments, forums, collaboration? And that's even before I start to worry about what will I do face-to-face, what will I do self-study learning, what will I do virtually. So, there's a lot of different choices when it comes down to blended learning. And I think, as we've moved through the years and we've seen organizations begin to mature, we do think that we're coming to the point where, there are some ideas emerging that are getting pretty concrete about what it means to do blended learning. And so, I think the challenge underlying that is that blended learning, it's not simply a way to do something. It's really a way of thinking about learning design. And since learning design can be kind of dangerous to open up and think hard, we think that providing worked examples can be something that will be helpful. So that's sort of what we'll be looking for as we'll go through the course of today. Cammy, let me turn it over to you.
Sure. Yeah. Great. So we, if you're familiar with Kineo, we know that we produce a lot of guides and a lot of information out there, and we've created a whole series of guides around blended learning programs. And so, as Chip mentioned, we're going to be following up with a series of webinars that focuses on that. So today is the first of these. What we're trying to do is have these be real companion pieces to the guide. So we don't want to just tell you what's in the guide. We actually want to provide a little bit something more in a short time frame. We do encourage you to go read the guides because there's going to be a lot of stuff in there that we don't even touch on today. So a lot of what we're sharing today comes from our clients, comes from their insights, and we're really excited to share those with you today. We do have a poll to kind of get us started, and we'll try to make it a little bit interactive here at the beginning. Sabrina's going to pull up the poll, and I do want to encourage everyone, if you have questions or comments, to put them in that question pane within GoToMeeting, and we'll try to address those either as we go along and possibly have some time at the end to tackle those as well. So Sabrina, let's pull up our poll now. And we wanted to get you all thinking about your leadership programs as they exist today, and how would you characterize them? So take a moment to think about them. Are you kind of just, do you have a single formal training event and we go in and we anoint people and now they're leaders, or is there a more sequenced activity of events? Is it all just happening on the job? Do you have a fully developed ecosystem that's really supporting all of that? So take a moment to answer, and we'll share the results here in maybe another 30 seconds, 20 seconds. And this is, a snapshot of what you have in place today. And if you don't feel like you can even answer this, we were limited to 5 options, so we didn't have a none of the above option, but you could certainly put that into the comments if you have a session. I mean, if you have a comment on that. So Sabrina, why don't we give another 3 seconds here? And oh, I think we lost our results. Chip, we're back to the slide deck.
Oh yeah, let me see. Let me get us fixed up there. Okay, and are we able to see the results from the poll?
I'm not seeing them. Sabrina's on the back end doing our production work.
I can jump in for a second. So it looks like 35% answered a sequence of mostly formal training events. That was the highest, with the highest response rate. And then 20% a sequence of multiple types of activities. and then 18% a set of resources used on demand, and 15% an ecosystem that contains all the above.
Okay, so it was a little hard to hear some of what you were saying there, Sabrina, but it looks like the sequence of mostly formal training, that sounds like the big winner for what you all are doing today. We want to pull over another poll and think about how you want, where do you want your leadership programs to be going? How do you want to characterize them in 3 years, you know? So what's that journey that you want to take your organization on as you think about moving the bar for leadership? And we'll give this one, we'll go a little faster here, I think. So in the ideal world, where do you want to take leadership within your organization, leadership training? And there's no right or wrong answer here. It's a trick question. And let's give another, I don't know, another 5 seconds, Sabrina. Does that seem all right?
Sounds good.
And when you're ready to share the results, Sabrina, if you can share results with us again, and just make sure you're speaking loudly.
It looks like the one that received the most responses, 80%, is an ecosystem that contains all of the above.
All right, that's the direction everybody wants to go in. An ecosystem is my new favorite buzzword. We could probably have a whole workshop on favorite buzzwords, but I think ecosystem is a great word, and it really does seem like the future. It's a system that can kind of support a full blend beyond. All right, so let's move on. Let's get into the content here. So one of the things that we've noticed is in leadership is well, and in business in general, right, is that things are complicated these days. Businesses are complicated, and the challenges that we're all trying to deal with are very complicated, and a lot of that falls on our leaders. So one of the challenges in doing leadership training, right, is that you want your leaders to kind of be able to do everything. There's a long answer, and we've looked at competency models that organizations have. DDI actually has, which is big thought leadership in leadership, 66 competencies they've named for leaders. Lominger has something like 67. It's more than a deck of cards. Can you train everybody in all of these things? It's just so much, right? So a little bit overwhelming. So how can you break it down? And are organizations doing that? Are you simplifying those lists of competencies if there's actually 66 of them? So we looked, one of our clients was Coast, and Coast is the world's leading industrial thread and consumer textile craft business. So chances are the clothes you're wearing have Coast thread in them, or the couch that you're sitting on. I mean, their products are everywhere. It's kind of it's the hidden thread, the fabric of our lives, quite literally. And what Coast was doing is they had never done formal leadership training within their organization. And they wanted to really focus for their frontline leaders and their middle managers on developing core skills and capabilities. And they whittled, that whole 66 competencies down to a set of core 8 competencies that they wanted people to focus on. And we see a lot of companies going in that same direction. So if you start thinking about what it is that you're going to focus on, can that put a different lens to the kind of leadership training that you're providing? So Coach had a really nice approach to it with just kind of whittling it down to the essentials. And so Chip, and we're going to show a little bit more examples of Coach as we go forward, because what they really did effectively with these competencies in this framework, which is very tight focused, is create a journey out of that. And that's what Chip's going to talk about next here.
Yeah, so thanks, Cammy. So moving on to that's the first worked example. And part of what Cammy mentioned that's so important about that is if you narrow your target, so when we have a more clear target to shoot for, we can afford to focus more on it. And so as we think about blended learning, we're able to create a journey. So, years past, when somebody would think about coming to some leadership training, often that would meant getting together in a hotel room like this and trying to have an event where I came in to be trained, and sometimes the expectation was that when I left, well, then I was trained. And what we see happening increasingly is organizations beginning to think about blended learning and 70-20-10 for leadership development, using this idea of a journey, using the idea that inside the notion of a journey, what we're able to do is that it takes more than training as an event to get to results. It means that I may need to have some assessment up front. I may need to do some practice in the field as part of my journey. I may need to, in fact, check to see whether I got there at the end by analyzing how I actually behaved back on the job. And a journey is a nice metaphor for that. And what we see some L&D organizations doing then is taking their role as not simply to provide the activity, but to provide the structure for that journey. Many of the activities in that journey may be things that happen that a leader in training, a leader in learning does with his or her manager or his or her team. So we see this notion of a journey taking root. This particular example is from an organization called the Institute of Directors, which trains people to be board directors, gives them those skills, and historically they've had a face-to-face offering, and they'd like to actually reach out to that. And one thing we wanted to share with this example is we see quite a lot of use of technology beyond a straightforward LMS to be able to support and structure that notion of how can we carry people through a journey, because while the idea is attractive, it means it's complex. There are steps to the journey, and we have to keep track. And technology is part of that. And in fact, it's something we're seeing not only in the leadership space, but we're seeing it across areas. So this is a different example which also lays out a little bit more clear idea of if I'm trying to figure out what I want to do with my own career. This is from work on What Color is Your Parachute that says how do I work through the journey of figuring out what I really want to do and coming to decisions about how do I manage my career. And again, the notion is that that's hard to do as a training exercise. It makes sense to do that as a series of activities, different reflections happening at different times. And a portal to be able to pull that together is a very useful tool. So,
Chip, this is Cammy. Just as you're talking, how is that different than what organizations have been doing up until now?
Well, I think it's different in a couple ways, Cammy. Good question. So one is that many organizations, I do think, because of simple delivery constraints, have treated leadership development as an event or a series of events. And so, we saw that, I think, in a little bit of our poll response. When we asked about the as-is state, the most common answer was as-is events. And we in learning often try to annotate those events with some pre-work we ask for and some post-work we ask for. And in many organizations, the sense is that we hope that some people will do that, but we don't really count on it. And I think the difference that's coming up here is that really we're trying to build a structure that says, we actually do have some discipline in that, so that if we ask you to do some pre-assessment before you come to understand your strengths in an area, that we have a platform that makes it easy for you to do that. We have some rigor that sees if that happen, so we can count on that having been done by the time we bring you in for an event. Or if we then say, when you go back into the field, you won't be done here until you've done some other work. We're now able to see some discipline to say, let's actually make sure that that work happens. And I think that's a good lead-in to the next worked example, which has to do with reaching as part of our blend outside of learning activities per se, but into making sure that performance happens where our business leaders really want it to happen, which is back on the job. And I think one question faced in leadership, it's faced in other areas too, is how do we tell whether or not our participants, the people who are in our programs, really reach, the business leaders have invested to get a certain set of capabilities out there in the field. How do we know it works? And that touches on, the kind of question of the year for many years, evaluation. And I think the continued interest in evaluation shows that, the answers, while we have as a field, are emerging. We haven't actually reached on those answers yet. I think what we're seeing as part of leadership development emerging is the notion that on-the-job assessments, where I demonstrate that I have actually been able to apply what I have quote-unquote learned back on the job and can bring back examples of that, are becoming a part of the blend. And so that's a That's a destination point in the journey where we don't stop to say we've run the program and got good feedback on it, therefore we're happy. We stop when we say, huh, and we've got reports back that people have applied what they've done in the field, and they're able to actually demonstrate those competencies to themselves and to their managers in a way in which we can get sign-off on it. So that's a third worked example. Let me turn it back to you, Cammy, because I raised the notion there of working with managers and incorporating them as part of the blend, and I think that has to do with the fourth example we wanted to bring forward.
Yeah, so traditionally, and this is a theme that we've touched on a little bit along the way, traditionally you kind of pack up your leaders onto a bus and you send them off to leadership camp, right? We're going to go off to a week at leadership summer camp, and the hope is that you're going to come back and poof, you're going to be a trained leader, and you're ready to go. And I think that's part of the mindset that we want to get away from, right? It's got to be this more integrated journey, and that's where this assessment and on-the-job performance observation really starts to make a difference. But what we're also seeing is that we've really got to pull in managers along the way. And so, who's developing new leaders, but it's the leaders helping develop their up-and-coming leaders, right? So this example for Coates that I touched on earlier, this is a 2-year blended program that Coates did for their frontline leadership. And it was truly a blend designed from the ground up. They had face-to-face workshops. They had a series of e-learning modules that focused on those core competencies, so acting with integrity, building one team. Those were self-paced pieces that they went off with. They had webinars along the way. But as you can see along the bottom of this diagram, there's this supportive module that threads throughout the entire thing. And that was targeted and additional training for the leaders of the people going through this program. So the leaders of the leaders being trained were there to support them through this process. It's really a change management experience for them. And additionally, the LMS actually had checkpoints, kind of gateways where the manager had to sign off on the person's progress through the content, having conversations, doing these observational checklists. So the manager was really held accountable for the performance of the person going through this leadership training program, and they were integrally, I can't speak today, they're very involved in the process.
Really
see
involved.
That as being essential, yeah, right. Really, really involved. And finding ways to integrate that. We don't want to send just people off to summer camp anymore. We've got to have ways where leadership is accountable for the leaders that they are developing to. And a lot of that now ties into our fifth worked example, which is creating these conversations and really creating this environment in which leadership can thrive.
Yeah. So to pick up on that, in the broad area of blended learning, I think one of the areas which I personally have found the most difficult to get my arms around, and I think I've seen some of our clients also find challenging to get their arms around, is the broad area of social. When we think about blends, we know that we want social to be some part of that, but social itself is a pretty broad concept. Social means we want people to be communicating with each other, outside of a communication from instructor to participant. But there's lots of avenues and venues and ideas for what that could mean. Should we open up a forum? Should we have a news feed? Should we use the company's existing instant messaging system? Which cohort should we have coordinate? How often should we do it? Lots of questions around the mechanics of how we integrate social and the delivery channels we use and the affordabilities that we provide. One thing that we've seen as an example here is the notion of starting in a different place when thinking about how to integrate social into a leadership development program. I think it becomes very difficult if you start with the question of the mechanics of it, which channels and who signs up at what point. What we've seen work as a kind of better shortcut to the answer is to step back and start with the question, what conversations do we want our leaders to have, and therefore what's the best way that we can actually generate those conversations. So sometimes this is done in programs like the COATS program by focusing on a particular topic being taught. Sometimes, particularly in times of leadership change, there's a bit more investment needed to create the conversations that we want participants to have. So this particular example is from a group called the Cooperative, which is the largest consumer cooperative in the United Kingdom. It has about 8 million members, and with their members, what they wanted to, with their leadership group, they wanted to introduce a new leadership framework. So not only did they want to train people and enable them on the skills of that leadership framework, they also wanted a conversation about why are we shifting to a new leadership framework, what does it mean, what do these ideas and these words in the leadership framework mean, and how are they going to influence the work that we do. And so they knew that they wanted social to be part of the answer to how they move forward. To try to figure out how to get there, though, what they realized is they really wanted to jumpstart the conversation. So the particular example we're showing here is what an example called an e-magazine, where what they did is they got a couple of groups, starting with some of the senior leaders and also representatives from leaders throughout the structure, throughout the organization, to come together and begin to seed the conversation. So instead of simply opening up the floodgates and hope that someone shows up to have a comment or a question, what they did is they made sure to put the kindling in the fire to get it started. And that was the key to getting the conversations that they wanted started. So let me take a moment and pause. What we've just gone through very quickly are kind of 5 worked examples. Before we broke, we wanted to share kind of a bonus round on the 6th. I think the trend, this is less a work example but more of a trend that we've seen supported in several different research groups, is the notion that also where organizations are investing their leadership development dollars is taking a bit of a shift over time. I think historically many organizations have invested heavily for the top levels of the leadership chain. We've often invested heavily at the bottom level of in high potentials, getting them into the leadership chain. Often there's been less focused attention on frontline leaders and perhaps one level up managers and managers. And what seems to be happening in the industry now is that there's a recognition that in fact those people are playing important roles. I think that the skills that they need are different than skills required at other points, and often organizations are feeling that those are capabilities that need to be bolstered. And so there's a new look at how investment is being targeted, often with the result that some additional investment is being funneled to the rows that are kind of in the orange on this chart. So it's not only that the way we're using blended learning and leadership is changing, but also where we're targeting is changing. So stepping back, I think what we try to do is, in terms of worked examples, show an example of focusing on a critical few competencies. So instead of trying to spoon the ocean and cover things broadly and hope some sticks, to invest in a targeted way in a few competencies for which we create a structured journey. There's a bit of color commentary. I think that's actually consistent also with the interest in an ecosystem, where that means that we can take some elements which are less of an immediate focus, less of a priority, and use an alternative approach to let those people who are need those capabilities but didn't reach in the inner circle to be able to get to them through an ecosystem. After we choose a few critical ones, to create a structured journey that helps people understand, why do I need this? Where am I on it today? How is learning going to help me after I've gone through some learning, gone through some experience? How am I doing? Did I reach there or not? And starting, with actually making that, how does it work on the ground? Assessing actual performance. I think, for a long time, there's been a sense that the most important person who's going to influence me as I'm learning on the job is the person who's my direct manager. And we're seeing techniques to wire in those managers of leaders, and also tackle the concern that sometimes they may not have the coaching skills that we'd like them to have. So how can we create out moments of truth for them and enable them to execute on those moments of truth? When it comes to broadening the conversation, integrating social, the example we tried to share was, it's often easier to think about that if you think first about what's the actual conversations we want to have, and do we need to take some work to get those conversations started? as opposed to opening up a broad channel of communication. And then finally, a sense of, as we invest in leaders, are we investing in the right ways? Do we need to put some investment where in years past we might have gone shy? So those are the key points that we wanted to share and the worked examples. I think we have some time for questions. So, nope, we're at the end of the half hour. So we ran a little shy. Let's see if there are some questions. We can spend a few minutes. For those who need to drop off, thanks for joining. This is Chip Cleary with Cammy Dean, who have been your hosts for today.
And we will, everyone, thanks for joining us. We'll make sure that we send out links, and you can get a copy of the guide that goes into some of what we shared today in a little bit more detail and some other ways up on the website. Looking forward to the next webinar, which will be on April 23rd, I believe, and that's going to be focused on sales and product training. So we'll look forward to having you as part of that. I was working on the slides for that this morning and getting excited by some of the examples that we'll be showing for sales and product training. I think the thing to consider with blends is really that you've got the right mix of ingredients and that you're targeting those investments in the right place, as Chip said. And today, certainly, the blended world isn't just classroom training with a little bit of e-learning tacked on. We've got a lot more tools at our disposal. So excited to keep sharing this with you and continuing the conversations. Sabrina will follow up with some additional information afterwards. Thanks, everyone.